So, hello everybody and welcome. It's lovely to have you to our next Blue Shield UK conflict webinar. It's my very great pleasure to introduce Professor Nigel Pollard. Nigel is an academic whose research focuses on the treatment and perceptions of cultural heritage in the Second World War and the application of that historical experience to contemporary and future conflicts. He's been a member of UK Blue Shield since 2012. And he's a professor in the Department of History, Heritage and Classics at Swansea University. He's trained as an archaeologist and has done fieldwork in Italy, Tunisia, Syria, Egypt, and the UK, published on Roman Italy, Africa, and the eastern frontier of the Roman Empire. But since 2011, his main area of research has been the treatment of cultural heritage in the Second World War, especially Italy. His monograph, Bombing Pompeii, World Heritage and Military Necessity, was published by Michigan Press in 2020. And I have to say, if this is an area you are interested in, I cannot recommend that book enough. It's a really great unpicking of not only the bombing of Pompeii, but the wider concepts of military necessity and cultural heritage protection in World War II. And it's a really good book. He's a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of London, and was a member of the UK Military Cultural Property Protection Working Group from 2015 to 2019, and has supported the UK Military Cultural Property Protection Unit training and consulted on the UK Cultural Property Armed Conflicts Act 2017. So he has a wealth of practical knowledge and of academic knowledge that he brings together about both historic cultural property protection and modern cultural property protection today. So Nigel, it's my very great pleasure to hand over to you for your talk, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Emma, and thank you all for being here. I'll just attempt to share my screen now. Are we all getting that okay?
Yes, you're good. Thank you.
Yep. Okay, great. Thank you. So fundamentally, as Emma suggested, much of what I do entails historical research into the destruction and protection of cultural heritage in the Second World War. And I seek to draw lessons from those historical experiences for contemporary practice. And most of the issues that are faced across the spectrum of cultural property protection in the Second World War are very similar to those that are faced today. But unfortunately, for one reason or another, many of those lessons typically were forgotten in the post-war period, and we sort of end up reinventing the wheel. So what I'm trying to do is sort of short circuit that process and highlight some of those issues again, so we don't end up having to relearn them the hard way in conflict. And so here are some of my themes relating to what I'm going to be talking about today, which is protecting domestic cultural property protection, cultural property in conflict, historical perspectives from Britain and Italy in the Second World War. I'm going to be doing exactly that, trying to highlight some historical lessons that are relevant to the things that we've been talking about in a more contemporary context over the last few months. And the key themes here are not at all surprising if you've attended any of the other webinars in this series, or if you know anything about the 1954 Hague Convention that provides the underpinning for what Blue Shield does. The key overarching theme, I think, is the need for planning and preparation, including identifying what the potential threats are and what can be done to mitigate them at a national, local and institutional level. In historical terms, all the major combatants in the Second World War had plans to protect their cultural heritage in the lead up to that conflict, often quite well developed plans. And in turn, those were often motivated and informed by the experience of those combatants in the First World War, which, of course, had only been about 2 decades before the outbreak of the Second World War. I'm not as sure that we've got that level of preparation and planning and experience in place now. I have no sort of privileged insight into that, but my general sense is that we're not as well prepared as combatants were in the Second World War for that. So going on from the planning and preparation, typically the plans that they generated involved in situ protection of structures and collections, evacuation of movable collections to refuges of one kind or another, or most typically a combination of both in situ protection and evacuation. Those are still the key options today, and we'll explore some of those as we go on. Another theme that I won't be saying so much about today is the need for documentation, identifying what needs to be protected, and then what's in a particular collection, so items can be located in the event of dispersal and looting, and so on and so forth. And you'll have heard about those, or will hear about those from other people in more detail later on, or in previous months. So broadly speaking, the kinds of threats that were faced back in the Second World War were similar to those faced today. All Second World War combatants prepared for the threat of, and also suffered, long-range strategic bombing, primarily of urban centres. Some of that preparation was also valuable in the event of fighting on the ground with accompanying artillery and air support. But the involvement of cultural property in ground combat also generated other sorts of issues and problems, as we'll see for Italy. Some case studies from Italy, which was invaded, of course, and saw fighting on the ground in a way that Britain didn't. I mean, Britain in the Second World War, there the primary threat was aerial bombardment there. Both of those threats, ground combat and strategic bombing, generated particular types of damage, primarily by blast and by fire. A third threat that was anticipated was that of looting of portable cultural property, potentially by enemy troops and or by notionally friendly troops or civilians in a situation where the security breaks down in the context of a conflict. And all of those sorts of things potentially might happen today. Perhaps from a UK perspective, some of those seem more likely to us, at least at the moment, than others, with perhaps things like long-range missile strikes as an equivalent of strategic bombing. The sorts of terrorist and hybrid threats that we might face today, which some other speakers have spoken about in previous webinars, were perhaps less explicitly prepared for in the Second World War. Although general public disorder was considered as a threat both to in situ protection of collections and as a risk in the course of evacuation as well. So some of those sort of general precautions and considerations are relevant to that sort of perhaps the terrorism and the hybrid threat that we might face today. So next slide. So going through some of the themes there. In situ protection was and remains, of course, a crucial component of any safeguarding plan in conflict. Buildings and monuments themselves can't be evacuated. Collections typically can't be evacuated in their entirety because there's too much of them, because some of their constituent parts are too big to move, and so on. And sandbagging of those sorts of immovables for protection against blast was a crucial component of Second World War safeguarding, and of course still is. And you'll have seen images of sandbag monuments in Ukraine, for example, just as you can see these images, archival images from the Second World War in London, Victoria and Albert Museum with workmen sandbagging immovable objects for protection against bombing. Similarly, in Westminster Abbey, the sandbagging protection of a medieval tomb of Prince John of Eltham there. Movable objects can also be secured in basement storage areas. Windows can be boarded up, and in some cases, for example, stained glass can be removed and put into protective storage. In the Second World War, the medieval stained glass of Canterbury Cathedral was removed and put into protective storage, while some of the Victorian stained glass there was left in situ and boarded up in some cases. The stained glass from York Minster was put in protective storage as well. Many of the historic stained glass, much of this historic stained glass in London was put into protective storage too. Protection against fire was hugely important, and one of the key themes of safeguarding in London in the Second World War was organised fire watching by staff and volunteers, watching out particularly for incendiary bombs that might cause fires in the roof or fall through into the main body of the building. Fire was a massive threat, as it is, of course, now. So fire watching out for for incendiary bombs, and provision of basic supplies for extinguishing them, water and sand, all of that kind of thing was a key component of safeguarding in wartime Britain. Similar practices were employed in other combatant countries, such as Italy. The Italian heritage authorities protected monuments with sandbags and wooden scaffolding and shuttering on an epic scale, to the point where some of the ancient monuments were almost transformed into new futurist monuments. One of my favorite images here of the column of Marcus Aurelius in Rome, as scaffolding was being put up, and then after the monument had been sandbagged and protected there. It was an important Roman monument. It had, as you can see, particularly from the first image, it had has a sculpted frieze that runs all the way around it that potentially could be damaged from blast and fragmentation there. With the protective measures there in the second image, it almost looks like a space rocket from a 1930s science fiction film, like the British film version of H.G. Wells's Things to Come, for example. And this program of monuments protection in Italy was really widely publicized in a big and lavishly illustrated hardback propaganda book that was published in 1942. This was clearly important for the self-perception of Italy as a country where heritage was important, the fact that it was putting all this effort into protecting its cultural heritage. So this big and lavishly illustrated volume, I've got a copy I bought from a second-hand dealer in Italy a while ago. It's a very impressive thing, and it's very striking that actually these very resource and labor-intensive protections of monuments, that like the column of Marcus Aurelius you can see here, was undertaken by the Italian authorities at a time when air raid precautions for people in Italy were actually quite poorly resourced and quite poorly organized. So it was identified as a particular priority. So the National Museum in Naples provides quite a good example, a well-documented example of an Italian museum in the Second World War. I've written quite a lot about this. The Naples Museum contained, as it still does today, of course, collections of important material from Pompeii and Herculaneum, Also, the Farnese collection of sculpture from which originally was excavated in Rome. In the Second World War, unlike now, it also had Naples' main public art gallery located there. So there were paintings in this building as well. And like other European museums at the time, it essentially had three options: to evacuate its collections, to protect them in situ, or again, a combination of the two. And the combination of the two was the option that was used. And we'll talk about the evacuation option a bit later on. But so the Italian state devolved down to the regional fine arts and antiquities authorities decisions on how to implement those strategies in detail. So in the case of the Naples Museum, it was Amedeo Maiuri who was the superintendent of antiquities for Campania, and his colleague in fine arts, Bruno Molaglioli, who were involved in taking the decisions on the ground here. And as it turned out, about 75% of the collection in the Naples Museum remained protected in situ, much of it very well protected. And again, here advertised in that 1942 Italian book, with all those photographs of things under sandbags, from the column of Marcus Aurelius and the Arch of Constantine in Rome, here to the galleries of the Naples Museum with these huge piles of sandbags held together by wooden scaffolding, protecting, for example, large works of sculpture that couldn't be evacuated easily. This protection was done right at the start of the war for Italy. Italy entered the war in May 1940. The remaining portion of the collection, as we'll see in a moment, was evacuated. We'll talk about that later on. It's a theme. The Naples National Museum also provides an example of some more sort of specialized and detailed in situ protection, again, which is feasible and is documented from more recent conflicts. So Maiuri, the director of the museum, was concerned about the potential for loss and theft that might occur in the course of evacuation, as well as potential for looting of the museum if law and order broke down in that area. And he had kept to one side from the evacuation process and oversaw the walling up of a very select group of very precious and fairly small items from the collection. So those included precious metal coins, but also things like these, the two Roman artifacts that were perceived as a particular value to him, the tazza farnese, which is this sort of cameo dish here, and also the famous blue vase, which is a cameo glass vase you can see in the image there, which had been excavated in a tomb at Pompeii. These are both relatively small. The blue vase, I think, is about 25 centimeters tall or so on. So they're relatively small and could be secreted in a void in the wall of the museum and then walled up. So Maiuri, in his post-war memoirs, describes how that process took place. He writes, going against the arrangements made by the ministry, so he was bucking his orders a little bit. I deposited the coins and the precious objects that couldn't be evacuated into a void in the museum walls. We did the job in secret at night, just three of us and the old and trustworthy plasterer who had to open up and seal the hole in the wall. So this is being done secretly. Only a few people know where this stuff is, so it can't be stolen potentially if law and order breaks down in the area. They literally wall this up in part of the museum wall. Everything was in galvanized boxes and well wrapped up like treasure in the tombs of the pharaohs. And again, as I've said, these sort of things are still done and are still practical for relatively small, discrete collection, but also things that are too big to move. Large pieces of sculpture can be protected in situ by bricking them up and pulling down the walling around them after the conflict is over. Those kinds of techniques are still employed, and as they were in the Second World War. Also comparable locking things in basements, not only locking things in basements, but potentially if you've got steel security doors, that sort of thing, those doors can actually be welded shut for the course of the conflict in order to make them more difficult to make it more difficult for those collections to be looted and stolen in the event of breakdown of civil disorder and those kinds of things. And those sort of techniques were used in the Second World War. They've been used in more recent conflicts. The disorders in Libya, for example, there, museum doors could be basement security doors could be welded shut and all of those kinds of things. That stuff's still well documented. So lots of lesson and lots of detailed technical lessons about how to do this effectively can be drawn from the Second World War discussion of it. So, of course, evacuation was and still is the main alternative to in situ protection. In Second World War Britain, the main focus of evacuation efforts related to London collections. As before the war, it was assumed that London would be the primary target of strategic bombing, both because of its importance as a capital city and also its proximity to bomber bases in Germany, because it was assumed that German Air Force would be bombing from bases in Germany. Some British Museum material, for example, much of the Parthenon sculpture, could be evacuated on a local basis, so that sometimes can be an option. And in the case of some of these materials from the British Museum, like the Parthenon sculpture, they were evacuated into a disused tunnel of the Aldwych branch of the Piccadilly line on the London Underground. So here you've got a contemporary archival image of some of that material in storage. Some of those tunnels were adapted to increase the airflow and reduce humidity and so on and so forth. So some adaptation for environmental conservation reasons there. Relatively close to the British Museum, of course, but actually quite difficult, particularly for the larger pieces of sculpture, because the lifts in the London Underground and the regular stations weren't really set up to carry loads of those sorts of weights, and things had to be taken in a rather roundabout way via the freight lifts in a few particular stations there. But other materials from the London collections were evacuated further afield. So in the first instance, the refuges for those collections were mostly stately homes just to the north and west of London, many of which had been identified already by a planning committee in 1933, so 6 years before the war broke out, emphasizing again the extent to which this was a planned operation and the importance of planning. I'm showing you one example here, not because it was massively important in that proceeding, but in that process, but as one example, mostly for sentimental reasons, because I could see it out of my bedroom window as I was growing up when I was a child. This is Mentmore Towers, the Rothschild stately home in Buckinghamshire, which was the venue which received some of the paintings from the National Portrait Gallery, evacuated from London in wartime, for example. And to highlight the scale and preparation of planning before the Second World War, this process of evacuation had been prepared for as a key option since, as I mentioned, 1933, and had been thoroughly rehearsed at the time of the Munich crisis in 1938. There were well-organized movement plans using the railway system and trucks. There were concerns that the evacuation process might be risky, not just because of enemy action, but because a breakdown in civil order was anticipated as something that might emerge at the beginning of the war as a result of bombing. So plans were made for armed guards to escort the convoys of works of art out to their intended refuges. Fortunately, the evacuation process was carried out in a relatively straightforward and smooth way, and the armed guards weren't needed, for example. But actually, the evacuation can be a risky business. Sometimes it can be more risky than leaving things in situ, and we'll hear more about those as possibilities later on from Italy there. Allowing your stately home to be used to house some of these evacuated collections wasn't necessarily altruistic on the part of the homeowners. It was sometimes seen as a way to avoid having their houses turned over to less desirable wartime occupation by evacuees, by schools, by the armed forces, for example. But stately homes proved to be problematic as refuges. There were often poor storage conditions. Parts of the houses were unheated or damp, for example. There were disputes with some owners over costs of heating, of accommodating necessary conservation staff, and so on and so forth. Also, with the fall of France, the bombing of Britain became more geographically wide-ranging than was anticipated, because German bombers could be based in France just across the Channel. And so some locations that were perceived as vulnerable were perceived as vulnerable now to accidental damage and collateral damage and things like that, even if they weren't being deliberately targeted by air forces. So the alternatives to stately homes as refuges in Britain were purpose-built or adapted refuges. And even before the Second World War began, some people thought that purpose-built refuges were the best solution. And one was actually constructed before the war near the National Library of Wales in Aberystwyth, which in wartime was used not only to store local materials from the National Library in Wales itself, but also for some paintings and other materials from the National Gallery in London. But this purpose-built storage, protected storage area was an exception at that particular time. But by 1941 to 1942, the problems of storage in stately homes had prompted the development of specialised art refuges in adapted quarry sites in particular. So the large disused Bathstone quarry complex near Corsham in Wiltshire initially had been adapted for use as a factory protected from the bombing of Bristol, so an underground factory to which production facilities could be moved from Bristol when Bristol was being bombed. And it was adapted for that with a mini railway system, with lifts, with offices and canteen facilities, heating, dehumidifiers, its floors and ceilings regularized and leveled, those sort of things. It wasn't a raw quarry, it was an adapted site. But by early 1942, there was less need for the factory space, and part of the complex at Corsham, the Westwood Quarry, was used as a specialised refuge for art, particularly from the Victoria and Albert Museum and the British Museum. And another key and famous example of a specialised storage area illustrated on this slide is the disused Manod slate quarry near Blaenau Festiniog in Wales, which was used from the end of 1941 onwards, mostly for National Gallery paintings. Again, the floors and ceilings were levelled out and heavily improved. Heating and dehumidifying equipment was added. Rail tracks were available there. This was in a very remote location, so somewhere that was unlikely to be bombed even by accident. And even if it was, the materials were secure, protected underground there. Both Corsham and Manod continued in use or potentially were available for use in the Cold War period. Corsham, another part of the Corsham complex, for example, included a Cold War era government bunker. But I don't think my understanding is that those sites are not currently suitable for reuse. Italy also had plans for evacuation of portable cultural property from cities that were thought to be vulnerable to bombing. The designated refuges in Italy were themselves mostly historic and religious buildings that were outside cities in locations that were thought unlikely to be bombed. So, for example, the refuges for collections from Naples, including those from the Naples Museum that we just saw, were such sites like the Loreto Abbey at Mercogliano. There's an archival photograph from the British School at Rome of the paintings crated up at Mercogliano down in the lower right-hand corner of this slide. That's a location to the east of Naples, and also Monte Cassino Abbey, which was between Naples and Rome, was identified as a refuge for portable materials evacuated from the Naples area because it was assumed as a religious site. In a less urbanized area, at least, it would be unlikely to be bombed. Unlike the in situ protection measures that we saw in the Naples Museum, the evacuations of the Naples Museum were undertaken late, after Naples had already been bombed and when Italy was already threatened with invasion. And that caused a number of problems. For example, wartime conditions as the war went on made availability of transport for evacuation more problematic than it might have been at the beginning of the war there. And worst of all, the Allied invasion of Italy meant that refuges in what had been thought to be safe locations ended up in the front line. So the hill of Monte Cassino in particular became a key position in the German defences between Naples and Rome after the Allied invasion of the Italian mainland. And of course, as you probably all know, the Abbey at Monte Cassino was bombed and largely destroyed by the Allies in 1944. So evacuation can be risky. The refuge itself may become unsafe as the military situation changes. That's an important lesson to learn and bear in mind when planning evacuation processes. Fortunately, the stash of evacuated art from the Naples Museum wasn't destroyed by the bombing of Monte Cassino because it had been evacuated for a second time, this time by German forces to Rome and then to the Vatican, which was a relatively secure location because the Allies very carefully avoided bombing the Vatican for political and religious reasons. But this operation of evacuation by the German authorities highlighted a second risk of evacuation. A significant proportion of the materials that were evacuated were actually stolen by German troops in an organized way and sent back to Germany and Austria, where they ended up being moved around Germany and Austria, but were eventually found at the end of the war in a German organized art refuge in Austria. The sorts of things that were taken by the Germans and sent back to Germany in the course of that evacuation included Titian's Danae painting here you can see on the slide, and also some of the bronze sculpture like this deer from Pompeii and Herculaneum that previously had been housed in the Naples Museum, evacuated to Monte Cassino, taken by German troops in the course of evacuation to Rome, taken back to Germany and ended up in Austria, where it was ultimately repatriated to Italy. So risks of evacuation are numerous. We can also see this in some of the risks to evacuated collections from Florence that took place in the war. For example, collections from Florence galleries like the Uffizi were evacuated out of that city by Italian authorities for protection from bombing. They were sent to villas in the countryside outside of Florence, the local equivalent of the British stately homes that we saw earlier. But again, there were risks to this strategy. Some refuges ended up in the front line of fighting on the ground, as in August 1944, the Allied British forces in particular tried to envelop Florence rather than attacking it directly. One example of one of these sort of rather improvised art refuges outside of Florence was in the Sitwell Villa at Monteguffoni, where you can see some of the archival images of that. Things like Botticelli's Primavera was evacuated. These things were stacked up against the walls of the villa, uncrated, unprotected there. And this villa ended up on the front line. And there's a really good written and recorded account by the BBC journalist Winford Vaughan Thomas, who at one point goes up to the front line in this location to record a radio piece for about the fighting going on in this area. And he goes into this villa, which is occupied by British, largely actually Indian troops at this time, and sees all these paintings, which he recognizes because they're so famous. And they're on the front line with artillery flying over them. Fortunately, by sheer chance, they survived unharmed, but this was a very risky refuge under the circumstances, and the risks to it hadn't necessarily been anticipated when it was chosen. The contents of some other refuges near Florence were taken again by Germans who claimed to be evacuating them for protection, and that may have been the case, at least in part. But they took them all the way back to the Italy-Austria border, where potentially they might be either taken across the border as loot into the Reich, or potentially used as bargaining chips on surrender. The stash on the Italy-Austria border was encountered by Allied troops at the end of the war. So here in the lower right-hand corner, you see another. These are all archival photographs from the British School at Rome. Here you see one of the American monuments officers looking at some of the crated up Florentine works of art that they've just recovered in Alto Adige on the border with the Italian border with Austria. So finally, I highlighted some of the potential lessons at the beginning, and I really re-emphasized those. So many of the successes of Second World War safeguarding, like the smooth execution of evacuations in Britain, were due to planning and preparation before conflict, both at the national and local level. My sense is that we need more of that planning and preparation now. And this needs to include awareness of and options for the full range of potential threats and risks, because they can change as a conflict goes on. The Second World War experience provides us with lots of detailed technical and practical lessons about how best to protect immovable and movable cultural property, where to locate refuges, and how to organise evacuations. Some of those lessons were reflected in the 1954 Hague Convention, the provisions of that, and others have been highlighted by ICROM and other practitioner organisations connected with conservation and protection and things like that. And I think a final lesson is that when a conflict's underway, it's necessary to respond to changing circumstances and learn from experience, to learn lessons and be dynamic about the process of cultural property protection. We can see that in a number of cases in the wartime experience. So the shift from stately homes to purpose-built refuges in Britain as a response to the unsatisfactory nature of the former, the shift from bombing to invasion as a threat in Italy, and the implications that has for refuges perhaps that were previously perceived as safe, like Monte Cassino, that no longer became safe. How do we respond to those dynamic situations in conflict? So I think we can learn an awful lot from the Second World War that's relevant to our contemporary experience. So thank you for listening, and I will unshare my screen at this point, hopefully. And I'm struggling a bit to unshare my screen because I don't use did that work? No.
Did, and thank you. Well, thank you so much, Nigel. And lots of thanks in the chat. Does anybody have any questions? I think people might be nearly ready for summer.
Stunned silence, everybody ready to go on holiday. I went on a
Well,
holiday last week, so I have to get back to work.
I mean, that was a really fascinating insight, and I think there was some very, very relevant points there that we can take away. There was a request in the chat for bibliographic references, if it's possible to share them. So if you're able to send me something, I can circulate that. And a quite practical question: who provided the sandbags?
Good question. I think there was a lot of I don't know that in Italy who provided the sandbags. In Britain, there was there was a huge program of air raid precaution preparations before the war and production of sandbags and making those available was all part of the lead up to the war in the UK. I'm really not sure. I mean, the sheer number that were involved in some of those Italian monuments must have been quite a substantial resource strain. But under normal circumstances, I mean, I used to, a few decades ago, I lived in a street that was prone to flooding, and the local government authorities would show up with sandbags when we needed to protect our house every now and again. So, typically that's a government local authority responsibility, perhaps with some support from armed forces when they're available. And of course, armed forces in training in particular were much more a feature of pre-war Britain than they are in modern European countries. So it's a good point, and it's a simple point, but actually, it again requires preparation and planning. You can't just magic up millions of sandbags when a war breaks out. There needs to be preparation and planning for it.
And now that you've woken everybody up now, were there any inventories of collections? How were they managed? The
Yes.
collections that were moved specifically there.
Yeah, that depended on the individual institution and its record keeping and cataloging systems. And as an example, because I'm particularly interested in the Naples Museum, I've seen copies of the inventories that were made by Mayuri when stuff was evacuated. So listing those stuff, and then also copies of the inventories that were made by the Italian authorities and Allied monuments offices in Rome when the things had been evacuated by the German troops to Rome, and then Rome had been liberated by the Allies in June 44, that show up those discrepancies between the number of cases that had been sent out from the museum and the number of cases that had actually arrived in the Vatican. And when the second inventory was made, nobody knew what had happened to that stuff. It was just recorded as missing, but then it could be identified when the refuge in Austria, where the stuff that had been stolen and taken back to Germany was recovered. It could be compared against those original inventories. So those are obviously really, really important inventories for and ideally digitized cloud stored inventories nowadays for museum collections that can be used to check evacuations, that can be used to reconstitute and identify things that have been looted and so on. That's a really important issue. So yeah, but they're very much TypeScript, people typing multiple copies of these things in wartime. And there's always the risk, paper documents can be destroyed, damaged, lost. So yeah.
I'm afraid we don't have time for the last question because we are at time for our webinar. So I'm just going to do a very quick plug to say we would love to see you after the summer. We're going to take a break for August because so many people are on leave. but we'll return in September, a little bit later than our usual date, to September the 26th, when one of Blue Shield UK's trustees, Dr. Lisa Moll, or Professor Lisa Moll, is going to talk about built heritage in conflict and the role of the Hague Convention and how we can protect it and what we can do about deterioration. And we'll be sharing a link to that a little bit nearer the time. And we hope to see you all after the summer. Thank you very much, everybody. And thank you, Nigel.
And thank you all for listening.